Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. Previously, we've discussed the ancient Near East. Peoples such as the Sumerians with the invention of writing and civilization, groups like the Chaldeans, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Kassites, and numerous others that will inhabit the ancient Near East and, of course, have some importance to future history and future civilizations. Of course, the Egyptians as well, and the Persians. But now we turn our focus across the Mediterranean and we start to look at the ancient Greeks. We begin with this lecture by Dr. Price discussing Bronze Age civilization. Now, first of all, in order to understand how the ancient Greeks develop, how their culture their culture will become so important to Western civilization, we first need to look at the geography, which Dr. Price will do, and the topography of Greece. It is very interesting to note that because Greece was so mountainous, that even though people live in relative close proximity to each other, they have different cultures and they develop differently because of the mountainous regions. It's not exactly easy to communicate with others. And as we go through these lectures, you'll find out, especially with the city-state of Athens and the city-state of Sparta, maybe the city-state of Corinth, how although these three city-states in Greece are relatively close together, they are totally different in a lot of ways. But before we get into the actual city-states on mainland Greece, we first will look at some of the more ancient cultures, such as the Minoans. Dr. Price will discuss the early Bronze Age culture of the Minoan people, and they are centered on the island of Crete, which is in the Mediterranean, of course, close to the Greek mainland itself. And this was about 3000 BC, which is about the year we began discussing civilization in the ancient Near East with the Sumerians, 3000 BC. So while we have the Sumerians over in modern-day Iraq, we have the Minoans here thriving, at least for a short time. They will thrive in the Mediterranean on the island of Crete. Now, there's a lot of very, very interesting facts about the Minoans that you will learn with this lecture. One is that, just to name a few, they had pretty elaborate technology for this time period. There was a discovery of a Minoan palace by Sir Arthur Evans. He was an archaeologist, and he actually discovered they had indoor plumbing. That's truly amazing. We're talking quite a long time ago. And of course there were other issues as well, but truly amazing. It's also will be interesting to find out with the Minoans, because we can't read their writing. It's called Linear A, and it has not been deciphered. Although we can't read their writing, they left a lot of art and ruins, obviously, for us to investigate. And one thing you'll learn about is that it seemed that bull leaping was very important and prominent in Minoan society, but yet you had both male and females that would do this activity. So this will lead a lot of historians to say that in Minoan society, men and women were equal. Well, Dr. Price has a little bit to say about that. He's going to explore whether that's actually true or not, whether men and women were equal in Minoan society. We'll have to find out the answer to that question. So that's very interesting as well. We also will explore a little bit about Minoan religion. It seems that they worshipped a fertility goddess, a snake goddess, if you will, from the statues that have been discovered on the island of Crete. And he also will inform us what happened to the Minoan civilization, because it does not exist. It's gone. So it's interesting to find out how this civilization, they did not have walls, so it seems that they were not in fear of invasion all the time. And they did have a navy, because obviously they're in a very strategic spot to trade with others throughout the Mediterranean region and the Aegean region. The Aegean Sea is right there by Greece as well. So it's interesting to discover exactly what happened to these people and why their civilization will eventually disappear. Now, with this upcoming lecture, Dr. Price will also turn his attention to mainland Greece, the southern part of mainland Greece, the Peloponnesus area. And he will discuss another civilization, the Mycenaeans. As well, there was an archaeologist, Schliemann, either way for me, and he discovered a lot of ruins and artifacts about this civilization, the Mycenaeans. They also had a script. It was not linear A as the Minoans, but it was called linear B. And we have discovered how to read linear B. A man by the name of Michael Ventris in 1953. So not too long ago, if you look at, from 3000 BC to the present time, that wasn't a long time ago, but he finally deciphered it. And Dr. Price has a really interesting story about how that came about that you'll find out. So we can read linear B, and we will discover with the Mycenaeans exactly how their society was structured. We know that they actually did have walls, and so that leads us to believe that they were maybe more warlike than the Minoans. And it's also discovered on the island of Crete that linear B writing. So it's believed the Mycenaeans had come over to Crete as well. So with the Mycenaeans, very interesting to see how maybe they differed from the Minoans. And what's really interesting is what happened to them. They will disappear as well. Their writing, linear B, will disappear, and we will not see writing again in Greece until about 750 BC. So that's quite a long time. In fact, Greece enters a dark age after the disappearance, destruction, what have you. You'll learn about that of the Mycenaeans. So let's find out about the Minoans and the Mycenaeans.
Today we're going to move our focus west. We've been talking in the past about Western Asia, the Near East, and North Africa, Egypt. And what we're going to do today is we're going to move across the Mediterranean a ways into Europe proper for the first time. And we're going to look at the Greek, we're going to begin to look at the Greek world. The Greek world consists of the Eastern Mediterranean basin, the area that surrounds the Aegean Sea. Although the Mediterranean is culturally diverse, we can consider it in many ways one geographical unit. The most distinctive feature of the area we're going to be looking at today, Greece and the Aegean, and really for the next few weeks or few days, is seasonal variation in rainfall. Summer rainfall is limited, and the weather in the northern Mediterranean is quite warm, quite comfortable. You don't have the kind of summer heat that you have in the Near East and Egypt, but it's a comfortable outdoor weather. In the winter, the winds shift and bring more rainfall. The average summer rainfall is 6 to 10 inches. In the winter, the rainfall average goes up to about 20 inches. The winter is the growing season in the Greek world. I want to say a little bit about the topography of the Aegean. This area that we call Greece is at the bottom of something called the Balkan Peninsula. It features broken lands. It's created by a land uplift where rising and falling even continues today. This is still an area of earthquakes and even some active volcanic activity. The rugged terrain makes only about 20% of the land in Greece agriculturally useful. These mountains are not very high. In fact, the highest mountain in the Aegean world is Mount Olympus, the so-called home of the gods, which is only about 10,000 feet high. Now, of course, by Louisiana standards, that's enormous, but by the standards of most mountain ranges, it's not really very high at all. The soil is very high in limestone content because of the wash-off from these primarily limestone mountains, and that makes agriculture even more difficult. It's good for olive trees, it's good for grapes, but it's not terribly good for the production of grain. In the hills and mountains of Greece, you have good scrubland, which makes it possible to produce and herd sheep and goats and other small livestock. Mineral resources are somewhat more dependable in the Aegean world, especially in Greece proper, than agricultural resources. Several sites near rivers yield a very high quality of clay, which makes it possible for the Greeks fairly early on to make fairly sophisticated, fairly sturdy pottery. Now, pottery is very important in the ancient world because pottery is not only what you cook with, what you serve food on, but it's also what you store food in. So pottery becomes sort of, I don't know, let's say the Tupperware of the Greek world, the stuff you can store and transport food and olive oil and wine in. There is, or at least in the ancient world, there was a very large deposit of silver near the city of Athens. In southern Greece, near Sparta, there were large deposits of iron. And in slightly later, right after the classical period, in an area called Macedonia, which is in northern Greece, there was a very large deposit of gold. Almost all of those deposits have been worked out by now. Because of the broken mountainous topography of Greece, travel on the mainland is very difficult indeed. In order to go from any point A to just about any worthwhile point B, traveling on the mainland, you have to cross difficult mountains, you have to go through very rugged terrain. But the shape of Greece makes it fairly easy to go anywhere you want to go by sea. There's nowhere on the Greek mainland that you're not close to a good harbor, close to good sailing. And so from a very early time, the Greeks become sailors. They become seafarers from a fairly early period. The very shape of Greece makes it possible to access the sea from almost anywhere. Now, another interesting consequence of the ruggedness of the Greek terrain is that Greek settlement patterns practically from the beginning involve groups of Greeks settling in communities in one mountain valley that's fairly remote, fairly isolated from other mountain valleys. And so Greeks tend to view themselves as members of a community first, like Athenians or Spartans or Thebans, members of a particular town or community first, and only as Hellenes, the word means speakers of Greek, when all of Greece is threatened by some outside force. Usually a Greek identified himself with his city first, and only on very rare circumstances would he identify himself as a Hellene, as a speaker of Greek. Now, we're going to start our study today with the Bronze Age in Greece from around 3000 BC down to about 1200. And we're not going to start on the mainland of Greece because the earliest Bronze Age civilization in the Aegean world doesn't really start on the Greek mainland. It starts on an island at the sort of very fringe, southern fringe of the Aegean Sea, and that island is called Crete. Early Bronze Age culture began on the island of Crete about 3000 BC. By about 2200 BC, a very high level of Bronze Age civilization had developed on the island. This culture today is called Minoan culture. I should say that the folks who lived on Crete at the time never called it Minoan culture. That term was made up, coined as it were, by a British archaeologist and eccentric named Arthur Evans. Evans discovered the sites on Crete in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and he was a Homer specialist. He was a mythologer, so he named the first city that he discovered, which is the largest actual Bronze Age city on the island. He named it Knossos, after the capital of the mythological king of Crete, first king of Crete, a guy by the name of Minos. And so then he named the civilization that he found there, the Bronze Age civilization that he found there, he named it Minoan civilization. Cities begin to appear on Crete around 2200 BC. The largest and most important of these cities is called Knossos, and Knossos is what we would probably call today a mixed-use community, sort of like Perkins Row in Baton Rouge. It is a conglomerate of dwellings, all squeezed together into one large edifice. It has shops and factories. It has sanctuaries and offices. It has a great palace in its center where we assume that the king lived, the ruler. A large palace was begun at Knossos in about 2000 BC. It was built around a large ornate courtyard, and it was surrounded by limestone towers. Additions were added to it with workrooms and storage areas and small temples. The whole structure is built up around the original courtyard. Evans equated this very tight style of design and architecture with the famous labyrinth in Greek mythology, the winding set of halls and caves where the great monster, half man, half bull, called the Minotaur, lived. The center of this mixed-use community housed, as I said earlier, a palace for the ruling family, complete with courtyards and indoor plumbing and baths and toilets and impressive rooms for these high-status occupants. The farther from the center one goes in this town, the less impressive are the dwellings. So we might say that the ruler lives in the center, and those who work for him as administrators or producers work around the outside of the city. Now, the arrangement of the city gives us some clues about the politics and government in Minoan culture. Knossos was a stratified society. Political and probably economic power rested at the top of the heap with the king and his administrators, and would then filter down through the rest of the population. We do know, we don't really know what the relationship was among the various cities on the island of Crete, and there are quite a few of them. The absence of fortifications around these cities would tend to suggest that they're probably all part of the same kingdom. At least it indicates that they don't fight with each other. The evidence that there is considerable traffic between these cities tends to support this theory. By a fairly early period, the various local pottery styles tend to merge into one pottery style that archaeologists call Middle Minoan. Arthur Evans looked at these towns and looked at this lack of fortification, and he immediately said that this is evidence that the Minoans were a peaceful civilization, a happy, unaggressive civilization, so unaggressive and on such friendly terms with other people in the Eastern Mediterranean that they simply never felt the need to build fortifications. They never felt the need to defend themselves because everybody loved them so much they didn't need to defend themselves from anybody. I did say Evans was an eccentric. Evidence from Egypt and the Near East tends to indicate that the Minoans didn't need fortifications for their city because from about 2000 BC down to about 1500 BC, they had the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. In fact, we know for a while during the New Kingdom in Egypt, the Egyptian pharaohs actually paid the Minoan kings to defend the Nile Delta. So the reason that Crete doesn't have fortifications is quite simply because the Cretan navy is the 800-pound gorilla on the Mediterranean block for nearly 500 years. Now, the economy of Minoan Crete is primarily agricultural. Most people were farmers, and the farmers didn't live in these great cities, these towns. They lived out in the countryside. They cultivated figs and olives, grapes and beans and peas. They also raised cattle and goats, pigs and chicken and rabbits to eat. Some of these crops, especially the figs and the beans and peas, could be dried in order to transport. So they are essentially, we can assume that the folks on Crete produce a large enough surplus that many of these products are dried and shipped out and sold in other parts of the Mediterranean. And from a very, very early period, nearly from the beginning of Iron Age civilization on Crete, Crete becomes famous for its olive oil and its wines. So Crete is essentially a maritime trading state. That's how it gets its living. Now, stuff is exported in pottery, and from a very early period, the Minoans are some of the finest early potters in the world, and we think they are probably the first people in the West to use the potter's wheel to make their pottery. We find Minoan storage vessels all over the Mediterranean, all the way from Spain to the Near East. Religion is the next thing I want to talk about, and I want to warn you that constructing religious patterns based on archaeological evidence can be very dangerous. We get some clues from the artifacts that we dig up on Crete, but the problem is that without the any kind of written documentation to go along with it, we don't always know what those artifacts mean, what those clues mean. We get some ideas from survivals in Greek legends, the Iliad and the Odyssey, for instance, but really we're kind of in the dark here. So this, take whatever I say about religion with a grain of salt. The Minoans most likely worshipped fertility gods and goddesses. We know that they worshipped a male fertility deity that is called the Cretan Zeus. What the Minoans called it, we have no idea. Zeus is, of course, equated with the king of the Greek gods. They believe that their male fertility god is a dying and rising god, that is a god that works in the cycles of the year, rather like they would explain in Egypt the Pharaoh does. Zeus is never depicted as a human being. He's always depicted either as a double-headed axe or as a bull's head. This cult may have been imported from the Near East. We just don't know, but that's where rising and dying gods tend to come from. Another very important cult was dedicated to small animal fertility and is associated with small statues of a woman, usually with her arms uplifted, holding a snake in either one or both hands, so she's usually referred to as the snake goddess. In limestone caves all over the island, archaeologists have found this snake goddess made usually out of terracotta or some other form of pottery, and she's always surrounded by tiny little figures of small animals, goats, sheep, bunnies, stuff like that. And so we figure she is a very important element of Cretan worship as well. Now, another interesting feature of Minoan religion, at least we think it's religious rather than simply entertainment, is called bull vaulting. Bull vaulting. At this point, I should caution you not to try this at home. From depictions of artworks at Knossos and elsewhere, it appears that young male and female Cretans jumped over bulls. Apparently, you would grab the horn of the bull as it was moving at you. You would flip over and do a handstand on the bull's back and then vault over behind the bull to land on your feet. Minoan art shows both men and women engaged in a wide range of mostly leisure activities. Recently, scholars have used the fact that women are depicted in lots of artistic works in Crete, lots of artworks. The fact that women are involved in this bull vaulting ceremony and the widespread use of these snake goddesses all over the island. Some historians have cited as evidence that women in Minoan Crete were remarkably independent, were amazingly active in the society, were fundamentally empowered, and this may be the case. It's entirely possible. On the other hand, it may not be the case. The truth is that since we're unable to translate Minoan text, which is called Linear A, we're unable to translate it, so we know very little of the intricacies of Minoan society in the Bronze Age. we don't have enough specific information to make the assertion that women are somehow more empowered, more independent, more free than they are elsewhere in the world at that particular point. After all, if we do a comparison, we find that Athenians have statues of women in what looks like positions of power all over the city of Athens. But we know enough about Athens to know that these women are very special. One of them is Athena, a decidedly empowered and independent goddess, and of course the patron of the city of Athens. One group of statues on the Parthenon show some very powerful female warriors, and these powerful female warriors are the Amazons. And the message of the view of these women is, when women get into power, be afraid, be very afraid. Another group of women who are depicted in Athens as strong and independent are prostitutes, courtesans, who were a fundamental part of Athenian society. Their behavior was special to their profession. Respectable Athenian wives and daughters were sheltered from both society at large and from any political activity in ways that we would find totally unacceptable. Similarly, Egyptian tomb paintings depict women who often appear on a par with men. But since we can read the history of Egypt, we can translate the Egyptian hieroglyphs, we know that equality for women was a fantasy held only for the afterlife and rarely practiced in this life. So while the lives of Minoan women may have indeed been more enlightened, more free, more equal, more independent than the lives of other women in the past, we should treat this idea with a pretty good-sized grain of salt until we can translate Linear A, until we can find a written record that tends to support that idea. Well, around 1400 BC, the high point of Minoan civilization, what we call the Middle Minoan culture, comes to a rather abrupt end and is replaced by a period of much lesser cultural attainment that archaeologists call the late Minoan. The late Minoan. The large cities of the earlier period suffer a great deal of damage, and there's very little repair that takes place from this point on. It appears that some of them are reoccupied, and several new cultural elements enter the picture. The most important of these cultural elements, the one that's the most significant, is the disappearance of Linear A, that original Minoan writing system, and the appearance of a new writing system called Linear B. Now, Linear B, we now know, when Arthur Evans first discovered this transition, he didn't know where Linear B came from. But we now know that Linear B comes from the mainland of Greece. It comes from the next civilization we'll talk about, called the Mycenaean civilization. This may indicate that Crete was invaded by the Mycenaeans of the mainland, and that the Mycenaean raiders took over the island sometime around 1400 BC. Now, the question then, of course, becomes, how did they manage to do it? If Crete had the strongest, most powerful navy in the Eastern Mediterranean, if Crete itself was probably a fairly strong island, how were the Mycenaeans able to conquer it around 1400? And that had, for a long period of time, for practically a century, had become quite a poser. Nobody was quite sure until in the 1960s it was discovered that there had been a volcanic eruption on the island of Santorini, which is about 140 miles north of Crete in the Aegean, a volcanic eruption on the island of Santorini, and it was a doozy, a very powerful volcano. And this eruption caused a series of tsunamis, very high, perhaps 140 to 200 foot waves, to wash over the island of Crete. The tsunami went due south and southwest and would have nailed Crete. Crete would have been right in the middle of it. If Crete was protected by a navy, then this navy would undoubtedly have been destroyed. The cities of Crete would have been devastated. This tsunami is so powerful that we find evidence of it as far south as 14 miles into Egypt and Libya, all the way across into the southern Mediterranean. And the tsunami waves, hundreds of them, would have caused enormous devastation and weakened Crete to the point where 70, 80 years later, the island could very easily have been taken over by the mainland Bronze Age culture called the Mycenaeans. At any rate, that is by 1400 BC, Minoan pottery styles have been replaced with Mycenaean pottery styles, and the Minoan civilization has simply vanished to be replaced by the Mycenaean civilization. So now we need to talk a little bit about Mycenae. And that requires that we turn our attention to mainland Greece. Although Greece proper, the mainland Greece at the bottom of what's called the Balkan Peninsula, although Greece proper really had been settled from as early as 6000 BC, the late Mesolithic, onward, and had a fairly high level of Neolithic culture, we're really going to focus on Greece in the Bronze Age today. We're going to skip the earlier Stone Age stuff and look at the Bronze Age culture that occurred on the Greek mainland. It is called the Mycenaean culture, and it takes its name from the first site that was excavated from this civilization, excavated in 1876 by a German archaeologist and eccentric, there's a pattern there, named Heinrich Schliemann. And it's worthwhile to tell you a little bit about Schliemann himself. Schliemann's a pretty interesting character. His father was a Protestant minister, a German Protestant minister. Young Heinrich apprenticed to be a grocer as a young man, and later he became a cabin boy in the northern German sea trade. At the age of 22, he became an import-export broker, and in 1871 he made an enormous fortune speculating on German imports and exports. He made so much money, he became so wealthy, in fact, that he no longer really had to worry about working for a living, so he decided to pursue his childhood dream. As a child, he had read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he believed that every word, every fact, every detail in the Iliad and the Odyssey were absolutely true. So he decided to use his great fortune to find the cities and towns that were mentioned in the Iliad and Odyssey. Initially, he moved to Turkey, where the Turkish government, the Ottoman government, gave him permission to undergo a series of digs at a place called HIST. And there he found what he believed was the city of Troy. Then it got a little confusing because he found not one city there, but 9 built one on top of the other. He finally decided that the 7th layer of the Troy excavation was the Troy from Homer's Iliad. Then he ran into some problems with the Turkish authorities, and so he moved from Turkey to Greece and began to look for places in Greece that were mentioned in the Iliad and Odyssey. He began to use the Iliad and Odyssey to provide him with clues to try to find the various places he was interested in finding. He found a Bronze Age Greek site that he decided to name Mycenae, after the fabled kingdom of Menelaus in the Iliad. And he went on to discover some other Bronze Age cities in Greece, and since then other excavators, other archaeologists have found a bunch more. Well, Bronze Age Mycenae is built on a hilltop. It was continuously occupied and improved from around 2000 BC until 1300 BC. It was a walled fortress with a large palace, lots of smaller buildings. Adjacent to the fortress was a cemetery with many beautiful objects that were buried with the very high status people who were buried there. There were several city-states on the mainland of Greece. Each of these was the center of government for a sizable area of territory, in fact, a much larger area of territory than any classical Greek state would have. Each state was ruled by a king, and the king's will, the king's holdings were administered by an enormous bureaucracy of officials and priests who took care of the business of the kingdom, saw that local taxes were paid, organized and trained the military, organized the populace when necessary. Now, most of the archaeological discoveries of Mycenaean sites have consisted of simply ruined buildings and artifacts. And in most of those sites, archaeologists found little shards of pottery on which there was some kind of writing. But the problem was, for most of these sites, these shards were much too small, all broken up, for anybody to get some kind of idea of what was on them. And then in 1938, an American archaeological expedition discovered another Mycenaean site called Pylos in the western part of the Greek Peloponnesus. When they excavated a cellar in the great citadel, the great fortress, they found 600 complete clay tablets. Each of these clay tablets had writing on both sides. And the reason that they were complete here, the reason they were able to find them, is when the city caught on fire, when the city was burned, the heat was so high in this cellar that they were actually fired. So they became durable pottery instead of just clay tablets, which would have broken up very easily. From these clay tablets, we're actually able to discover an enormous amount about the economic and political life of the Mycenaean city-state. And we're able to do that because in 1953, an English archaeologist and linguist named Michael Ventris succeeded in deciphering the clay tablets. Now, we know he was an obsessive-compulsive worker. He spent thousands and thousands of hours studying these things, but he tells a story, probably isn't true, but it's so much fun, I thought I'd give it to you. He was obsessed with these tablets, with trying to decipher them, trying to say what they meant. So obsessed that he would literally spend weeks in his office. He had a cot set up. He would work on these tablets and then lie down for a few hours on the cot and then get up and go back to work again. Ventris said that he fell asleep one night at his desk, totally exhausted, in the wee hours of the morning, his face presumably lying on a linear B tablet. And he had a dream, and in this dream, Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, appeared before him and shouted, "Ine Elliniki," which means, "It's Greek." And Ventris woke up and began to treat these writings as if they were Greek, and lo and behold, they were a very early form of Greek, and Ventris was able to translate them. Now, this discovery is very important because it showed that the language of the Mycenaeans was not only a member of the Indo-European languages, but an ancestor to later classical Greek. Now, the Mycenaeans themselves then were Greeks, one group of ancestors of the later Greeks. Before this discovery, historians and archaeologists had accepted the Greek myth that the original Greeks had invaded the Greek mainland in the early Iron Age and displaced the other peoples that lived there. Linear B argues that the Greeks were always there. There were always Greeks, or at least since about 3000 BC, there had always been Greeks on the Greek mainland. Anyway, it would be wonderful if Linear B had contained wonderful stories of Mycenaean heroes, or maybe sang of the trials of the Greeks before the great walled city of Troy, or some such, but unfortunately this is not the case. These 600 complete clay tablets are basically economic records. They list goods deposited here and there. They list chariots built and arrows built. They list beans and olives and wine and honey transported from one place to another. We don't find out much about the heroic age of the Mycenaeans, but we find out a heck of a lot about their economic and social structures. The king, each citadel, each of these fortresses was an independent kingdom. The king, who was called the Wanax, ran a particular kingdom, and the king was connected in some way with the religion of the Mycenaeans, so he was essentially, there was an element of theocracy to the governing of Mycenaean city-states. These great citadels where the kings lived were essentially huge fortresses with enormous thick walls that indicates that there's a great deal of warfare on the mainland of Greece, probably both keeping invaders out and the Greek kings fighting among themselves. The very fact that the tablets are economic records suggests that the Wanax controlled the economic life of the region that he ruled. The king at Pylos, for instance, where the records were found, collected tribute and taxes from a very large area of southwestern Greece. He apparently had a vast number of bureaucrats a very large army made up mostly of chariot warriors to help him maintain his government and maintain order in his state. On the basis of this evidence, it's now possible to draw some tentative conclusions about Mycenaean civilization. There are many centers of Mycenaean civilization, many kingdoms in Mycenae, and the various kingdoms are run by a very powerful central ruler who is equated in some way with the gods. Mycenae has a very high level of technology for the Bronze Age, and we know that because a few Mycenaean families, probably the kings and queens, are buried in very elegant, large beehive tombs. They're called beehive tombs because they're actually built like a beehive and then covered with dirt, with gold and other precious items, and the precious metals and precious items that they're buried with come from all over the Eastern Mediterranean. So this indicates that a great deal of trade is taking place here. They're not, of course, the poor are simply dropped into a hole in the ground with a few pieces of pottery. So we can argue that Mycenaean society is a very stratified society, with the king at the top and peasants, very poor peasants, at the bottom. Now, all this might sound a little familiar to you because it's very similar to what we saw earlier when we talked about Near Eastern civilizations. The Mycenaeans have a divine or semi-divine ruler. They had a highly centralized government and a small ruling class. Why is it so similar to the Middle East? Well, probably because the Mycenaeans had contact with the Middle East, and so when they developed their Bronze Age civilization, they learned what they could from the Hittites and those who preceded them, from the Egyptians, and they try to copy this form of government, these institutions, in Greece. Now, between 1200 and 1100 BC, the Mycenaean civilization collapses and disappears. There is considerable disagreement as to the cause of this collapse. In fact, interestingly enough, there is a sudden and catastrophic decline of civilizations all over the Eastern Mediterranean. I think I mentioned in an earlier lecture that between around 1200 BC, over 50 cities are destroyed in the Near East. The Hittite Empire simply vanishes. The Egyptian state becomes much weaker and open to invasion by 1100. And so this catastrophe of 1200 BC not only deals a great deal of hardship to the Near East, but it also seems to have brought down Mycenaean civilization as well. Whatever the cause, the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, the collapse of Bronze Age civilization in Greece was complete, or nearly complete. All of the traits that we associate with the Mycenaean civilization disappear. Linear B writing vanishes, not to be found again or used again. Writing doesn't start again in Greece until 750 BC, another, 300 years down the road. And when it does reappear, it's based on the Phoenician phonetic system rather than linear B. The great citadels, the great fortresses of the Mycenaean kings are abandoned, left behind, overgrown. No large buildings, no elaborate tombs are to be found again for about another 400 years in Greece. Metal doesn't disappear completely, but bronze begins to change to iron. We begin to see the opening of the Iron Age in Greece. This is the beginning of the transition from the end of the Bronze Age and the end of the Mycenaean Age, the end of the high cultures of the Mycenaean Bronze world. This is the beginning of a transition to a different kind of Greek world, but very hard times will develop between the end of the Bronze Age and the rise of any kind of new civilization in Greece. And this period that we'll talk about next time is called the period of the Dark Age of Greece. It lasts about 300 years. Next time we'll cover that, and we'll start to talk about the rise of the new Greek civilization toward the classical civilization of the Greek world.
Well, from this lecture, it seems that the Minoans may have been destroyed by an earthquake on a neighboring island, causing tsunamis. Of course, we know what destruction that can cause, even in modern times, which allowed them to become overrun by the Mycenaeans. And it was interesting to discover the Mycenaeans, we don't really know what happened to them. And that not only did their civilization and did their culture disappear, maybe overrun by barbarians, we don't really know, but other very powerful peoples in this region also met destruction as well at this time in 1200. So that was very interesting. For our next lecture, we'll continue discussing ancient Greece, and we'll find out a little bit more about that dark age that was ushered in after the Mycenaeans. Until next time.